when I think of the idea of pluralism, I think as a Canadian, we tend to think of it as something that just happens. It's the life we lead. Maybe we forget about some of the struggles that have caused it to happen. But you're talking about a challenge that South Africa faced in extreme, and that a lot of other places face now, which is how to go from being a place where you're part, not of a nation, not of a plurality, but of a subjugated and dehumanized group, majority in that case, somehow to being part of a country where you can be part of a plurality. Like it says on the American money, e pluribus unum, from our plurality we are one. How do you make that happen? And when I think about that, I think about the line that has always rung out to me in that Bill of Rights that was just presented is something that was unique at the time to the South African Constitution, and in its language is still unique, which is the second right in the Bill of Rights, appearing after equality, but before the right to life, and which reads, "Everyone has inherent dignity and the right to have their dignity respected and protected." And I don't know, I've always thought that that's sort of the hinge on which that transition turns, is this right to dignity and so on. It's the point where you move from being a group, being a subjugated group, to having at least the possibility of existing in a shared society. And you've had to cite that second right quite a lot in the rulings over the 15 years and so on. Can you tell me how that works in practice in using a Bill of Rights to build a plural society?
Yes, well, you know, the miracle, as it's called, we were living it in exile already. And I was just so deeply moved by Oliver Tambo's whole approach. And it was so educative to me. I get the credit for being the person who persuaded the ANC to have a Bill of Rights. That's not true. I was very skeptical of a Bill of Rights. I belong to critical legal studies kind of groupings, don't give too much power to the judges. And Oliver Tambo persuaded me for the reasons that I gave. And it was part of his broader philosophy. And you felt he lived it. As I mentioned, I'm very secular. He was deeply Christian. He often thought of becoming a full-time Anglican minister. And his vision was the whites in South Africa are too narrow, inward, selfish, wrapped up, self-referential to ever imagine the country belonging to everybody. We African people, black people, who've suffered so much for being who we are, we will show it is possible for black and white to live together. We will show ourselves, we'll show the world. And that wasn't from a position of weakness, it's a position of strength, huge moral strength. So when Mandela comes out of prison and he goes around speaking at meetings of the country with his former guard with him, that's not from weakness, it's from strength. And people are amazed. He's not angry, he's not trying to beat us up. But he's secure, he's serene in that. And it's that core, that sense of human dignity that was we found it necessary to put it in the Constitution. Equality is fundamental, of course. Freedom is fundamental. But you can get tensions between freedom and equality quite often. And we found dignity is the bridge between the two. In practice, certainly in the same-sex marriages case, certainly in the case that I mentioned of the situation of African women, widows and so on, dignity, that provides the answer. And you only get true equality, not if it's formal equality, technical equality, even material equality of the soul, of recognition, and that's where human dignity comes in. And interestingly enough, one of our imports from Canada was precisely on the question of the foundation of equality, a solitary decision by Claire Leroux de Bay in the Supreme Court, where the other judges were trying to find complicated formulations supporting equality. She said human dignity is the foundation. If belonging to a certain group results in you being denied your dignity simply because you belong to that group, as a woman, as an immigrant, as a black person, then that's a violation of equality. We took that over. We actually cited her. So thank you, Canada. Thank you, Claire.
That's interesting. And through that, you've been able, I mean, if you look at South Africa now through a half full bottom of a glass, the legal equality, the equality de jure has held up robustly. As you know, the recent government crisis stopped short of being a complete societal shutdown because the protectors were protected by a strong majority protection in the Constitution. Not just equality of black and white South Africans, but the even more complex range of religious and tribal and racial and class and gender and sexual divisions among South Africans has been quite robustly protected. On the other hand, de facto equality has been harder to materialize. Development progress seems stalled. The economy's in trouble. Maintaining a unified government has been difficult. This is a tough time in South Africa. Do you find that there's a limit to how far bills of rights and laws can go toward creating equality on the ground?
A constitution doesn't create equality. A constitution gives you the freedom to move. It gives you a set of values, certain deep basic principles. And our Constitution speaks about achieving equality. It doesn't assume that there's equality and government mustn't do anything to disturb it. It assumes we're living in an unfair society. And we've declared that in our court when it came to property rights. We said you can't apply the old English or Roman Dutch law on property in a country where instead of possession being 9/10 of the law, dispossession was 9/10 of the law. And that has to be the context in which we understand evictions, for example, of poor people from land that's needed for development, whatever it might be. So it's become quite important, the interpretation. But really, these are questions of political will. And for the electorate to answer in their own particular ways. What gives me confidence about South Africa, our problems are enormous. We can't blame them all on apartheid. Overwhelmingly, it's still a relic of 300 years of oppression and dispossession, lack of education, access. Of course, those things have a big impact. But we're making our own mistakes, and sometimes they're worse than mistakes. The things are happening that are dishonorable and quite unacceptable. But what gives me confidence is a combination of two basic factors. One is we've got a strong constitution, not just on paper, but we've got institutions to protect it. So the court came out. There was jubilation throughout South Africa. We watched on television. We watched on the smartphones. People were excited. Well, I suppose there are other countries. A whole day, I don't know who was working on that day. But suddenly it's possible to hold the president to account for something everybody knows wasn't right. That was immensely important as a symbol and as a practical thing. And the public protector. But it's not just that. Elections are very meaningful. Local government elections, ANC knows they might lose Johannesburg, they might lose Pretoria, Port Elizabeth. So in that sense, the Constitution provides something of either to frighten ANC to improve or to get an alternative coalition in power. But that's the one thing. The Constitution really means a lot, and we've got institutions to protect it. The other is we have a very lively population. People speak out. They're not scared. They even fight in Parliament. I was saying, if your Prime Minister wants any tips on how to deal with the opposition, come to Cape Town. But what I'd like to add is, if our president wants any tips about how to apologize, and look as though you really mean it, come to Ottawa.
There could be a back and forth dialogue, I think, yes.
But people speak their mind. They're not afraid. They speak out on phone-in programs, in the streets, demonstrations, and that's got a lot to do with the freedom we've won. We're not going back on that. And so we can bring about the changes that we need. Maybe the third important factor that's often underplayed, poverty is cushioned. The super rich are super richer, so the gap is bigger. But a third of the population get welfare grants. I think it's the only country in Africa. It's not the neoliberal dystopia that's projected. The World Bank, by the way, advised us in '94 to have rapid land reform. So they weren't against change. They said without that, the country will never come right. The 3.5 million homes have been given free to poor people living in shacks, which means a quarter of the population have moved from shacks. They're not
and that's partly because housing is a right enumerated in the bill.
But not only because it's a right, because there was a very intense move. It's intolerable that millions of people in the urban areas should be living in shacks. And if you take the Gautrain, which goes underground from from the airport to the center of Johannesburg or up to Pretoria, you pass through huge areas and you don't see a shack in sight. And I'm sure they didn't have the rebuilding there just so that passengers on the train wouldn't see anything unsightly. There's a very big black middle class. You go to any shopping mall on weekends, and in fact, it's the black middle class driving the economy. There is change. There's water reaching 90% of the people, clean water, a huge thing for women. There's electricity. It's great for studying and all the rest. But that doesn't permit or justify corruption. On the contrary, it doesn't permit or justify wastage of funds on stuff where it's not required, and lack of accountability, and the crime also can't be explained away simply on that basis. So we've got heavy problems, and I would like to see the country we were fighting for achieving the society that we wanted, rather than playing down the significance of what we achieved. It wasn't just something wonderful that happened in the past and now it's all gone. The wonderful thing in the past has left more than its imprint. It's left institutions, and we still have memories. And there's a huge debate going on inside the ANC now. It's not just between the ANC and opposition. The most interesting debate, and we'll have to see how that's resolved, who comes out on top. But we know in the background that strong civil society, terrific press, you won't mind me saying that, will you? Very strong investigative journalists. We know about all these things. The world knows about all these things because the cameras are there, the journalists are there. In fact, it's almost an amazing thing to see a pro-government article in a newspaper. You wonder if you've forgotten the not, if they left out the not.
Yeah, and they'll get roundly condemned for it, too.
Yeah.
One last question before we turn to the audience. As you say, it was a close thing back when there was this pitched battle between proponents of power sharing, of one government for blacks and one government for whites, even territorial division potentially, and a shared society. And pluralism prevailed. But when you look at countries now that are facing those sort of struggles, I mean, you could say that there's sort of a hierarchy. The most difficult thing is the plural society built on some form of individual rights, with one government for all. And then you get up to layers of ethnic federalism, and power sharing, and then finally secession and ethnic statehood and so on. And it looks today like those lower level solutions are the ones that are more popular. when you look at people talking about an end game for Syria and Iraq or something like that. So many territories around the world, the pendulum's almost swinging away from ideas of pluralism toward ideas of separate but equal, if you will. Do you think that that's an argument that can be won today? Or when things get so heated, is it impossible?
I wouldn't make that argument. If ever there was an area where one size doesn't fit all, it's how pluralism can be most effective in upholding human dignity and humanity and peace, bringing about peace. It's so history and context affected and driven. So maybe if you take Syria, for example, where these issues are being discussed now, part of the problem is there's a very powerful group, as I see it, around Damascus, where the leadership is authoritarian perhaps, but it's seen as our leadership. This is our country, and it's been dominating the rest. I don't know what the ideal answer would be to have something like South Africa, but maybe it's just not feasible now at all. So I wouldn't say autonomy is not the answer. If Scotland wants to secede from UK, that's not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing. It's just a thing, and if the people want it, I don't see it as being problematic. In our case, the background was Bantustan's division, apartheid. Right. They used the language of pluralism. The pluralism as understood there was the total opposite of the pluralism I see up here, but that was the language of it. The proposals being made during our negotiations were not for physical autonomy, territorial autonomy, but ethnic autonomy or different groupings, then moving away from formal race groups to political parties. That was their way. And I remember the one guy came to me and said, "We've got away from race, it's political parties now," as though that resolved everything.
Yes.
So I don't think one should hold up the Canadian model, for example, as the model for the world. It's a model for the world. And it's a model for countries that have a similar history, composition, evolution to Canada, where, to my mind, there's no doubt about it, the waves of immigration have enormously strengthened the country, and a sense of being Canadian. And then the whole Quebec, rest of Canada thing was kind of resolved. I wouldn't say fully resolved, but it's not flaming. But you know, when it was there, you wouldn't have to touch wood. You'll feel the flames even here.
Yeah.
And even that has, been quite complicated. So it's Canada, but maybe if you take account of
I should ask, if it had gone the other way, if it had ended up being a power-sharing structure of some sort, could you have worked in that? Would you have run the court under those circumstances?
It would have been very difficult for me. But, you take history where it leaves you, and you do your best within that. So our whole life has been that. But we always had this clear goal. It was in our Freedom Charter of 1955, this idea of a single South Africa, basic rights for everybody. We fought around that. I often say, and let me say it here, this should be included in often, there's only one good thing that apartheid produced, and there's usually silence and shock. Anti-apartheid.
Yes. I think we have time to take a couple questions from the audience. And do we have someone there with a microphone? Yes, we do. And our first question comes from Susan Basili, who's the director of the International Women's Rights Project. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. I just realized.
Thank you for all of your life work. It's Susan Basili, and I just wanted to thank you, Albie, for all of your life's work and your storytelling. And I'm glad you talked about the Bay decision and the image of the courtroom filled with rural women. And several times you've mentioned the courageous Tuli Madonsela, the public prosecutor, public protector, sorry. But I want to take you back to one of your early statements about the paternity of the Constitution and provide many people here who may not know some of the stories of the maternity of the Constitution.
In fact, when I first used that, I said paternity or maternity. But the reason I dropped it was that you know who the mother is. The mother is the person who gives birth. And the mother, in that sense, was all of us who were involved, men and women. And paternity I'm using in the sense to highlight it's the basic concept of Oliver Tambo. But the point is well taken. And I just felt it's a bit clumsy to say paternity, maternity, but obviously I made the wrong decision.
What I meant is, I know that you have some wonderful stories about the incredible role of the vibrant South African women's movement in the Constitution, and maybe you could share a couple of those.
Sure. Our Constitution states South Africa is a united sovereign state guided by the following fundamental principles. And the first one is non-racism and non-sexism. I think it's the only constitution in the world that uses the term non-sexism. It's got a long history, which I'll tell on another occasion, but we had to fight very hard for that. And it was the women's movement and the women's section of the ANC wanted it in. They said, we've suffered from colonialism and racism, but in effect, are we going to hand over power from one gang of men to another gang of men? The definition of freedom is very interesting. And that was, the ANC had decided, now this was 1994, that 3 out of every 10 people on their PR lists had to be women. So it wasn't putting women in to make up the numbers, it was moving women up to make sure they were amongst those who were elected, having been chosen by the branches. So ANC had 30% in Parliament. There were some women in other organizations. In effect, they had a blocking third in terms of the Constitution. And amongst one of the results that came out of that was a definition of freedom that's also unique. It wasn't just freedom from arbitrary detention, detention without trial and so on. It included freedom from violence from public or private sources. And that was in our Constitution of 1996, coming from the input of the women. And there were other areas. At one stage, we had a clause in the Constitution where we suggested rights for women. And those of us men who proposed it thought we were very liberated. Rights for women included equality in public life, equality before, during, and after marriage, and affirmative action to deal with past discrimination and disadvantage. And we felt, aren't we liberated, aren't we wonderful? And the women in the organization said, well, what about sexism? The cultural things, the practices, the habits, and so on. Shouldn't that be somewhere in the Constitution? So then we put that in our draft. And then somebody else says, but what's this thing about rights for women? Aren't women voters? Aren't women... They should be right throughout. The whole Constitution should be crafted with a gender sensitivity. And that had its impact, very strong section on the rights of the child. Now, of course, it's not a purely women's issue, but it was the women who were pushing, not just to say that the court shall take account of the best interest of the child. Long list of rights of the child, the freedom rights that I've mentioned, and there are other areas in our Constitution where you can see the impact directly, if you like, the maternal, specific maternal input that came about because of the very strong mobilization of women inside and outside Parliament. It was also a cross-party thing to quite a large extent. At one stage, in fact, when we were negotiating, the ANC insisted that there would be 2 representatives of each negotiating party, 1 male, 1 female. And some of the parties said, well, where will we get the woman? And the moment I loved the most was when Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi took her baby to the negotiating table because we didn't have a creche there at that stage. She was kind of embarrassed, but we were thrilled. Somehow it humanized our negotiations at that moment in a way that nothing else could have done. The little baby being suckled, she breastfed because she didn't want to lose out on the discussion, and there weren't alternative arrangements for her. So the presence of women in the constitution making and in the drafting of the constitution was very strongly felt. One doesn't feel that strength today. It wobbles. It wobbles quite a lot for a whole variety of reasons. One reason, a sad reason, but it's found in many countries, is the very success of the women's movement in getting women in high political positions, judicial positions. It creamed off a large section of the most brilliant, the most effective women's leaders in our general struggle. And then people get tired and they get caught up in bureaucracy of governing, and then others become defensive and they're worried about losing their jobs, and some of the oomph was just lost.
Do we have time for one more question? A small one. Does somebody have a particularly pithy and well-articulated question? We should auction it off or something.
With a short answer.
Not one that begins with, this is more of a statement.
Thank you very much. My name is Tom Saras. I'm the president of the National Ethnic Press and Media Council of Canada. I visited your country, Your Honor, during the apartheid and after that. My question today is, besides the political process that you managed to bring to the country, what about the social justice? There are terrible things down there as far as I know. I don't know if the government took any action to help the little people. Thank you.
Well, that's what we're having huge debates about. What's good in South Africa is everybody accepts from all parties that the situation is unfair, it's unjust, that the disparities of wealth are intolerable. There's nobody who says it's better in the long run to have it. Nobody argues from that point of view. But so much depends upon, I believe, on integrity in all parties. And integrity is especially necessary in the ruling party because they have so much power. And people get dismayed if they see top leaders behaving in a purely defensive way, not acknowledging failures and ducking and diving, and only when they're compelled to do so. And that's intolerable in any country. And it's particularly sad in our country where there's been such a marvelous struggle over the years. What many people are pointing out is during the marvelous struggle there were very bad episodes. Yeah. And I think it's healthy that that's happening. I used to get so upset when people would speak our glorious People's Army, Mkhonto we Sizwe, a glorious this, the triumphalist kind of presentation. It's unreal, it wasn't like that. We had struggles inside the struggle, very serious ones. Lots of bad things happened. We had torture, which we prohibited, but it came out into the open. We had opportunists. We had people who took money. We had men who assaulted women who were under their command and so on. We had all those things. But what was so positive then was the leadership of people like Oliver Tambo and Chris Hani and Joe Slovo and the others. They emerged clearly as the leadership. They gave the direction. That's why it's so important at the top, the symbol, the people. They don't even have to be brilliant. They don't even have to be superb organizers and so on, but they have to be honest. They have to be honest. They've got to listen. And I think that's what millions of South Africans are aching for, and certainly this South African sitting in this chair at this moment is aching for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me invite onto stage to give the closing remarks somebody who's I would say has served as Canada's de facto ambassador for the specific notion of Canadian pluralism during her years as Governor General and in her larger life, Adrienne Clarkson.
C'est pour moi un plaisir énorme de remercier Albie Sachs pour ce discours tellement humain, tellement intéressant, tellement personnel. C'est quelque chose d'inouï parce qu'au fond, on voit quelqu'un qui a vécu la lutte et qui a réussi contre tout, envers et contre tout, une vie qui menait à l'espérance, à l'espoir pour tout le monde, and somebody who now represents for us something, I suppose, remarkable in the sense of seeing a whole historical epoch that you have lived and that you have summed up. I have to say that for people of my generation who were at university as I was, going into university in the late 50s, the Sharpeville massacre was the galvanizing force for our 17 and 18-year-old souls. The Sharpeville massacre, the writings of Trevor Huddleston, Not for Your Comfort, the marvelous Anglican priest who wasn't appreciated by his institution totally, and who was pulled from South Africa. The fact that we didn't buy Outspan oranges, smoke Rothman cigarettes, buy South African sherry, even though it was so cheap and we were students. And even to this day, I have to say, I find it difficult to buy South African wine. It's just a thing with me. Those things mark you forever. And then as a journalist, I went to South Africa in 1975 to do a documentary under apartheid time. I was given the classification of white so I could stay at the same hotel as my crew, but our cameraman, who's a superb cameraman, was of Indian origin and he wasn't classified that way, so he had to stay in another hotel. We had a time which was extremely difficult, but we managed to do a documentary and we put it on the air. It was 1 hour long. At that point, the High Commissioner from South Africa wrote to the president of the CBC and said this woman should be fired, and the documentary is biased, untrue, wicked, all the things you can imagine. And the president of the CBC wrote back a very simple letter, which is in my archives now in the National Archives of Canada, which said, "Dear High Commissioner, thank you for your note. The program was done by the CBC by a respected journalist, Adrienne Clarkson. The CBC is an independent agency reporting to the Parliament of Canada. Yours sincerely, Al Johnson." Al Johnson later went to South Africa and was involved with some of the work after apartheid ended. But I was struck this evening by your use of words like integrity, dignity, the words of generosity, the words always of openness, the words of understanding of the other, the words that somebody truly versed in Ubuntu understands. I exist because you exist. And that great gift of that African philosophy is something which we everywhere must interiorize in order to understand what it is to be human and to function as a human being among other humans. His Highness the Aga Khan has frequently reminded us that we are creations of a single creator, and therefore we do attach ourselves to each other, even if we don't realize it, because we are part of that single project. To be reminded of that is always something which is to be first and foremost in our minds as we go forward and think about what we can do for our world, how we can take the example of your life, so magnificent as it has been, with its tribulations, with its trials, with its resounding successes, and with the feeling in the end, which we are all left with after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that the country of South Africa had been able to come to terms in the most human of ways with the kind of generosity and the kind of understanding and perception which is so rare for human society. When you had that dreadful thing happen to you and you lost your arm and you were blinded, I know some of your colleagues said, "We are going to avenge you." And you said, how? By cutting off somebody's arm or blinding them? And then you said, "Roses and lilies will grow from my arm. That will be my soft vengeance." Thank you very much for sharing your soft vengeance with us. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. I'm going to open it for him. It's our equivalent of a matryoshka. Aha. Oh, yeah. Aren't you glad I offered?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm quite excited now.
It's going to be this big.
It's an Inukshuk. It shows where to go, but he's always known where to go.
Now, this is beautiful. I thought it was a mug. Now, would you mind wrapping it all up again?
Ladies and gentlemen, this has been a remarkable evening. We are so appreciative that you could be here with us. And again, thank you very much, Albie Sachs, for a remarkable and an evening full of insights. I would just like to ask you to remain in your seats so that His Highness and Justice Sachs can take their leave. And thank you again, and we hope to see you again.